I should have known my life was about to fracture the moment my father-in-law smiled at me like I was already gone. My name is Daniela Torres, and for 17 years, I was the invisible spine of Sterling Investments, the woman who made billions appear on spreadsheets like magic while men in designer suits took bows on CNBC. I didn't lose my job quietly. I didn't get eased out with a severance package and a handshake. I was replaced by my husband's younger brother, a man who once asked, dead serious, whether NASDAQ was a musician. But I'm getting ahead of myself. On paper, everything looked perfect. Sterling Investments was untouchable. 0 losing quarters. Pension funds, universities, sovereign wealth clients from countries whose names took practice to pronounce. Journalists called my father-in-law, Richard Sterling, a visionary, a legend, a genius. The truth? He was branding. I was substance. Every morning, I arrived before sunrise, coffee burning my throat, eyes locked on data streams that decided whether teachers retired with dignity or worked until their hands shook. I built strategies. I absorbed risk. I carried the pressure silently, because competence doesn't need applause. Richard loved applause. And then, one Tuesday, ordinary, unremarkable, cruelly normal, he walked into my office and erased me with a sentence. Clear your desk by Friday. My son will replace you. 17 years. Gone. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I smiled, because I knew something Richard didn't. When you build something from the inside, when every client trusts your judgment, even if they don't know your name, you don't lose power when you're pushed out. You expose everyone who never earned it. That Sunday, we sat at his Hamptons mansion. Marble floors, crystal glasses, egos large enough to need oxygen. My husband squeezed my hand under the table, sensing something was wrong. He didn't know his father had already detonated our future. And when Richard announced his decision like a victory toast, when the room froze and his son lifted a wine glass with shaking confidence, I realized this wasn't betrayal. This was arrogance meeting reality. And reality always collects its debt. By Monday morning, the first client call would begin the collapse. By the end of the week, billions would vanish. And by the end of the year, the man who fired me would be signing his empire away with a trembling hand. I didn't plan revenge. I just stepped aside and watched the truth do the rest. Before everything imploded, before boardrooms turned hostile and family dinners became battlegrounds, my life followed a rhythm I trusted. I was 39 when Richard fired me. 17 years earlier, I'd been 22, fresh out of graduate school, exhausted, ambitious, and painfully invisible in rooms full of men who mistook confidence for competence. I met my husband, Michael Sterling, at a finance conference in Boston. I was there to present a risk modeling paper no one wanted to hear because it didn't sound exciting enough. Michael was there because his father insisted he learn the business, even though Michael never wanted to inherit anything except independence. Michael was different from the rest of the Sterling orbit, quiet where they were loud, thoughtful where they were theatrical. He listened, actually listened, when I spoke. Asked questions that showed curiosity instead of dominance. When we started dating, I didn't even know his last name carried weight. He introduced himself as Michael, not a Sterling, and that alone told me everything about the man he wanted to be. When Richard eventually offered me a position at Sterling Investments, it came wrapped in patronizing praise. "You're sharp," he said, eyeing my resume like it was an interesting novelty. "Let's see if you can keep up." I didn't need his approval. I needed access. Within 6 months, I was correcting his trades quietly. Within a year, he stopped asking questions and started taking credit. Within 3, the fund's performance changed so dramatically that clients began requesting meetings with Richard's strategist. That strategist was me. I didn't mind staying in the background, at least not at first. I told myself results mattered more than recognition, that loyalty would eventually be seen. That family meant something. I married Michael 5 years in. Richard toasted himself at the wedding. His wife, Catherine, kissed my cheek like she was blessing a charitable donation. Their younger son, Tyler, barely looked up from his phone. Tyler had always floated through life cushioned by money and lowered expectations. He failed exams, got second chances, failed again. Richard called it finding his path. I called it avoidance. At Sunday dinners, Tyler would brag about books he never finished, deals he didn't understand, confidence borrowed entirely from his last name. Richard laughed indulgently. Catherine defended him reflexively. Michael cringed quietly, and I stayed silent. That silence became a habit. At work, I absorbed stress no one else saw. At home, I buffered Michael from his family's expectations. When Richard boasted at cocktail parties, my firm's success? Sterling blood. I smiled politely and corrected spreadsheets in my head. The warning signs were there. Richard resented how much clients trusted me. Tyler resented how little he understood. Catherine resented that I couldn't be molded. And Michael? Michael believed love could outlast ego. I did too. That belief, that effort, loyalty, patience, could outwork entitlement was the real foundation of my life. And like any foundation poured on a lie, it eventually cracked. When Richard fired me, it wasn't impulsive. It was the result of 17 years of envy, fermenting quietly. I just didn't know yet how catastrophic his decision would be. For all of us. Looking back, the shift didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It seeped, in the way cold air slips under a door, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore once your skin starts to prickle. It began months before that Tuesday. Richard started holding meetings without me. Not the public meetings, the ones meant to impress clients. Those still required my presence, because even Richard understood one brutal truth. When questions got real, I was the only person in the room who didn't bluff. No, these were private meetings, closed-door lunches, strategy sessions that somehow never included the person who actually built the strategy. The first time it happened, I told myself it was normal, a founder wanting privacy, a man in his 60s grasping for relevance. The second time, I noticed the pattern. The third time, I heard my name said in the hallway, my name followed by silence. At home, Michael tried to keep peace the way he always had, by smoothing edges until there was nothing sharp enough to cut anyone. "He's just stressed," Michael said one night as he loosened his tie, shoulders sagging in that familiar quiet exhaustion. "Dad's been talking about retirement again. He's scared." "Scared of what?" I asked, though I already knew. Michael hesitated. "Of being replaced." I laughed once, short and bitter. He can't be replaced. He was never doing the job. Michael flinched slightly, not because he disagreed, but because he didn't like the way truth sounded when it wasn't softened. That's what love with a Sterling looked like, constantly translating reality into something the family could swallow. Then Tyler started showing up more. Suddenly, he was at the office 2 or 3 times a week, wandering the halls like he belonged there, wearing suits that fit perfectly but carried no weight behind the eyes. He'd stop by my door, lean on the frame, and toss out lines like, "Crazy day, huh? Markets are wild. Dad says the fund's gonna pivot soon. Big stuff. Big stuff." He always spoke in fog. If I asked a direct question, what pivot, what strategy, what sector, he'd blink, smile, and say something vague like, "Diversification, the usual," as if managing billions was the same as ordering brunch. I didn't confront him. I didn't complain to Richard. I didn't even tell Michael how deeply it unnerved me. Because part of me still believed competence was enough. That results would protect me. But the atmosphere kept thickening. One afternoon, I walked into the executive conference room and found Tyler sitting at the head of the table, my seat, while Richard stood beside him, hands on Tyler's shoulders like he was presenting a trophy. "This is my son," Richard said to 2 senior analysts. "He's going to be spending more time learning." Learning. I watched Tyler's fingers tap against the polished wood, restless, impatient. The analysts avoided my eyes. Their discomfort hung in the air like smoke. I smiled anyway. The same practiced, neutral smile I'd used for years. The smile that said, "I'm fine," even when my pulse beat too fast. After the meeting, one of those analysts, Mark, a quiet man who'd worked under me for a decade, caught me by the coffee station. "Are you okay?" he asked in a low voice. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the liquid swirl. Why wouldn't I be? Mark glanced around, then leaned in. "Something's happening. The board's asking questions about succession." Succession. A word that belonged to monarchies, not money management. "What kind of questions?" I asked, keeping my tone even. Mark swallowed. "Who the clients really trust." I already knew the answer. So did Mark. So did Richard. That night, I sat beside Michael in bed while he scrolled through emails on his phone. The lamp cast warm light over his face, softening the lines of worry around his mouth. "You've been quiet lately," he said, not looking up. "I'm thinking," I replied. "About what?" I hesitated. Then, carefully, gently, because I didn't want him to feel like he was choosing sides, I said, "Do you think your father resents me?" Michael's fingers paused on the screen. He looked up slowly, eyes searching mine the way they always did when he wasn't sure how much truth I could handle. "I think," he said, voice low, "he resents anyone who makes him feel small." I exhaled, the breath leaving my chest like surrender. Michael reached for my hand. His palm was warm, steady. "He won't do anything reckless," he added quickly, like patching over what he'd just admitted. "He might posture, but he won't cut me," I finished. Michael nodded, forcing confidence into his expression. "He needs you." And that was the dangerous belief. Because Richard didn't see needing me as reality. He saw it as humiliation. And humiliation, to a man like Richard Sterling, was something he'd burn his entire empire down to escape. The final seed of conflict came 3 nights before Tuesday. A family dinner in Manhattan, smaller than the Hampton Spectacle, but sharper, because in smaller rooms, there's nowhere for tension to hide. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling wine, and said casually, "We need fresh energy at the firm." Catherine nodded, as if he'd said something noble. Tyler smirked into his glass. Michael's eyes flicked toward me. I kept eating, my fork steady, though my stomach tightened. Richard continued, "You know, Daniela, you're brilliant, truly. But brilliance is replaceable." The word hit me like cold water. Replaceable. I looked up slowly. "Is that what you believe?" Richard smiled, pleasant, polished, poisonous. "I believe the Sterling name will always carry Sterling investments." And in that moment, I felt it. Not fear. Not anger. Something worse. Certainty. Because I realized Richard wasn't testing me. He was warning me. And I still didn't stop it. I went to work the next morning like nothing had changed. I kept building forecasts. I kept managing risk. I kept protecting people who didn't even know my name. I kept believing loyalty would save me. 3 days later, Richard walked into my office and proved loyalty was never the currency he valued. Tuesday arrived quietly. No thunder, no warning, just another gray Manhattan morning where the city hummed like it always did, indifferent to personal disasters. I was already at my desk by 6:30 a.m., jacket draped over the chair, coffee cooling beside my keyboard. The glow of my monitors reflected back at me. Charts, forecasts, models I'd been refining since midnight. Tokyo markets had closed strong. Europe was waking up cautious. By the time New York opened, we'd be perfectly positioned. 17 years of instinct told me it would be a good day. That instinct had never failed me. At exactly 8:17, my office door opened without a knock. Richard Sterling didn't knock. He filled the doorway the way men with unchecked authority always do, chest forward, jaw tight, eyes already annoyed that the world hadn't adjusted itself to his schedule. His suit was immaculate, his expression carved from entitlement. "Daniela," he said, like my name was a formality, not a person. I looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. "Richard." No greeting, no small talk. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and leaned against my desk as if he owned the air in the room. "My son will replace you as chief investment officer," he said. "Clear your desk by Friday." For a split second, my brain simply stopped. Not in shock, in refusal. I waited for more words, an explanation, a punchline. None came. "Your son," I repeated, voice calm enough to fool even myself. "Tyler," Richard said, nodding once, like he'd just solved a difficult equation. "Effective Monday." The room felt smaller, tighter. I became acutely aware of my breathing. Too shallow, too fast, and the faint buzz in my ears like static. "Tyler." The same Tyler who'd once leaned across the Thanksgiving table and whispered, genuinely confused. So is the Tao a company or a guy? I folded my hands on the desk, fingers interlaced to keep them from shaking. "On what basis?" I asked. Richard's lips twitched, irritated. "This isn't a debate." "No," I said softly, "it's a risk assessment." He exhaled sharply, already annoyed. "You've had your time. The firm needs legacy. Continuity." "Continuity," I echoed, "by removing the person who actually runs the fund." His eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone." There it was, not disagreement, disrespect. I felt something shift inside me, a cold clarity spreading through my chest. "Richard," I said evenly, "Tyler doesn't have the licenses. He's failed the exam 3 times. He doesn't understand portfolio risk at scale. He's never managed a client relationship." Richard straightened, bristling. He has Sterling blood. And just like that, the truth stood naked between us. This was never about performance, never about trust, never about results. This was about ego. I studied the man in front of me, the man I'd protected, propped up, carried quietly for nearly 2 decades. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. He hesitated for half a second. "Long enough." "Clear your desk by Friday," he repeated, turning toward the door. I felt heat rise up my spine, sharp and immediate, but I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I smiled. A slow, controlled smile that made him pause with his hand on the doorknob. "Interesting choice," I said. He looked back confused. "You're installing an untrained successor over 17 years of institutional knowledge," I continued calmly. "That's bold." Richard frowned. He'd expected pleading, gratitude, fear. He got composure. "You'll train him," he added dismissively. I laughed. Not out loud, just enough breath to let him hear it. "That's not how this ends," I said. Richard scoffed. "You think you're irreplaceable." I met his eyes. "No, I think you're about to find out you were never essential." His face hardened. "This conversation is over." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." He left. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing too loudly in the sudden silence. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my screens, the same screens I'd stared at thousands of mornings before. Charts still moved, numbers still shifted. Markets didn't care about pride or inheritance. My pulse finally slowed. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so catastrophically stupid that my mind needed somewhere to put the disbelief. 17 years, replaced by bloodline. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting to the skyline beyond the glass. He just handed his empire to gravity, I thought. And gravity never misses. That Sunday night, at the Sterling family mansion in the Hamptons, Richard would announce his decision like a coronation. My husband would find out in front of everyone. And I would sit there, wineglass in hand, already knowing exactly how this story ended. Shock doesn't arrive the way movies promise. There was no collapse, no screaming, no dramatic exit where I slammed a door and reclaimed my dignity in heels, echoing down a marble hallway. Instead, there was silence. A strange, heavy quiet that followed me out of the office and all the way home, settling into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. That night, Michael cooked dinner. He always did when he sensed something was wrong, moving carefully around the kitchen, trying to fix emotional fractures with olive oil and routine. The smell of garlic filled the apartment. Normally, it would have grounded me. That night, it didn't. "You're quiet," he said gently, setting a plate in front of me. I stared at the food. Pasta arranged perfectly, thoughtful, earnest. "I was fired today," I said. The words landed between us, sharp and final. Michael froze. His hand tightened around the edge of the counter. "What?" "Your father," I continued, voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "He's replacing me." "With who?" he asked, already knowing. "With Tyler." The color drained from his face. "That's not— He can't. Daniela, this is insane." I nodded. "Yes." Michael ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "Did you argue? Did he give a reason?" "Legacy," I said. "Blood continuity." Michael laughed once, harsh and disbelieving. "Continuity of what? Failure?" I watched him unravel, anger rising in him like a tide, while something inside me remained eerily calm. I didn't yell, I told him quietly. I didn't fight it. He stopped pacing, turning to me. "Why not?" "Because part of me was tired," I thought. Because another part of me wanted to see what happened when entitlement finally stood alone. "I didn't need to," I said instead. Michael sank into the chair across from me, elbows on the table, head in his hands. "I should talk to him," he muttered. "He can't do this. He needs you." I looked at my husband, the man who'd spent his life loving people who mistook restraint for weakness. "He doesn't think he needs me," I said softly. "He thinks he's correcting a humiliation." Michael looked up, eyes red. "And what do you think?" I took a slow breath. "I think he just made the most expensive decision of his life." The next few days passed in a haze of controlled professionalism. I showed up early. I finished reports. I documented everything. I left nothing half done, not out of loyalty to Richard, but out of loyalty to myself. Colleagues avoided my eyes. Some offered awkward sympathy. Others whispered. One afternoon, Mark stopped by again, closing my office door behind him. "They're asking Tyler to sit in on calls," he said quietly. "Clients are confused." "They should be," I replied. "You okay?" he asked. I met his gaze. "I will be." But at night, when the apartment went quiet, doubt crept in. Did I stay too long? Did I make myself too useful, too invisible? Did I mistake tolerance for respect? I replayed every moment I'd swallowed irritation, every time I'd let Richard take credit, every dinner where I'd smiled instead of speaking. And then came Sunday. The Hamptons mansion loomed against the fading light like a monument to excess. White stone, endless windows, a house built to impress people who already had too much. Michael squeezed my hand as we walked inside. "You don't have to stay," he whispered. "I do," I said, because I needed to see it. The table was already set. Crystal glasses, linen folded just right. Tyler lounged in his chair, wine glass half empty, confidence borrowed and brittle. Richard stood at the head of the table. When he made the announcement, when he said Tyler's name and my title in the same sentence, replacing one with the other, the room went still. Catherine gasped. Michael's fork clattered to the plate. I felt every eye turn toward me. My chest tightened, not with shame, but with something sharper. Clarity. I met Richard's gaze and smiled. Not because I was unhurt, but because I finally understood. This wasn't my ending. It was his beginning. And mine would start the moment I stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own decisions. Monday morning arrived, dressed like a warning. Gray sky, low clouds, the kind of air that pressed down on the city as if even Manhattan was bracing itself. I walked into Sterling Investments at 6:30 a.m., out of habit more than obligation. Markets didn't pause for ego, and neither did I. The lobby lights hummed softly. The security guard nodded, uncertain whether I still belonged here. Technically, I didn't. Tyler was already in the main conference room, already meaning he'd arrived sometime after sunrise, hair slightly damp, suit immaculate but worn like a costume. Papers were spread across the table in chaotic stacks, compliance manuals, client files, documents thick enough to crush confidence. When he saw me, his face lit up with visible relief. "Daniela," he blurted, standing too fast. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Thank God. I've been here since 5, and there's a lot." I set my bag down slowly. "There usually is," I said. He swallowed. "Dad said you'd help me transition." I looked at him, really looked at him, not with anger, not with superiority, just with clarity. "Tyler," I said calmly, "clients with billions don't want a transition. They want certainty." He nodded too quickly. "Right, of course, totally. I just thought maybe we could co-manage for a bit." I poured myself coffee from the break room. It tasted burnt and stale, but grounding. "This isn't a group project," I said. "You're the CIO now." His smile faltered. The first call came at 7:30. Greenfield Pension Fund. 400 million under management. Retirees who depended on consistency more than charisma. Tyler fumbled with the mute button. His hands shook. "Morning, Daniela." Robert Martinez's voice came through. Direct, no nonsense. "Heard there's a new sheriff in town." I gestured for Tyler to speak. Hi, Mr. Martinez," Tyler said, voice cracking. "I'm Tyler Sterling. I'm taking over as Chief Investment Officer." Silence. Not static, judgment. "Your experience?" Martinez asked flatly. Tyler glanced at me like a child looking for permission. I gave him nothing. "Well," Tyler said, sweat forming at his temples, "I've been learning from my father and reading a lot of books about markets and strategy." I closed my eyes. "Books," Martinez repeated. "Daniela made us a lot of money. Why should we stay?" Tyler opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I watched the moment his confidence collapsed under the weight of reality. "I'm not the CIO," I said quietly when he looked at me again. "You are." The call ended quickly. Too quickly. By 9 o'clock, Columbia's endowment requested an emergency meeting. By 9:30, Norway's sovereign fund sent a single-line email asking for clarification on leadership stability. Translation: "What the hell are you doing?" Tyler spiraled. He Googled terms mid-conversation. Used words incorrectly. Promised follow-ups he couldn't deliver. At 10, Richard stormed into the office. "What's happening?" he roared, face flushed. "Greenfield just pulled out." Tyler's voice shook. "They asked things I didn't know. Daniela wouldn't help." Richard turned on me like I'd committed a crime. "You sabotaged him." I met his glare evenly. I did nothing. The assistant burst in, pale. "Sir, the board's on line 1. Columbia just gave notice. 320 million. The room went silent. Richard's confidence cracked audibly. I stood, smoothing my jacket. "This," I said calmly, "is what succession without competence looks like." By noon, Sterling Investments was hemorrhaging. And for the first time in 17 years, I stopped catching the fall. The silence after collapse is louder than the collapse itself. By the end of that Monday, Sterling Investments felt like a building after an evacuation alarm, lights still on, desks still occupied, but everyone moving with the stunned, hollowed expressions of people who knew something irreversible had happened. I left the office before sunset. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I didn't stay to clean up someone else's mess. Outside, the city moved on. Taxis honked. Pedestrians laughed. Somewhere, someone was celebrating a promotion that hadn't yet turned into a nightmare. I walked home instead of taking the subway, needing the distance, the cold air cutting against my face like proof I was still real. That night, Michael didn't ask questions. He just wrapped his arms around me while I stood rigid at the kitchen counter, staring at nothing. I feel like I failed, I said finally, the words surprising me as they surfaced. Michael pulled back slightly, searching my face. Failed who? Everyone, I whispered. The clients, the analysts, even Tyler. Michael frowned. Tyler chose this. I know, I said, but I still watched it happen. That was the truth I couldn't escape. I hadn't pushed Richard. I hadn't exposed Tyler. I hadn't manipulated anything. I had simply stepped aside. And watching someone fall when you know how to stop it leaves its own kind of bruise. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was fractured. Snippets of boardrooms, ringing phones, Richard's voice looping over and over. Sterling blood, legacy, replaceable. The next morning, headlines flooded my phone. Sterling Investments in freefall billions at risk. As leadership shifts. Son of founder, sparks. Client exodus. Michael read them over my shoulder, jaw tight. They're blaming your father, he said carefully. They're blaming everyone, I replied. That's how panic works. By Wednesday, the financial press had sharpened its knives. By Friday, Richard filed a formal complaint with the SEC, accusing me. Market manipulation. Breach of fiduciary duty. Client interference. When my lawyer called to tell me, I laughed. Once, sharp and almost hysterical. He's still trying to control the narrative, I said. But after the call ended, after the laughter faded, fear finally crept in. Not for my reputation, for my future. I sat alone on the couch that afternoon, laptop closed, phone face down, the apartment unnervingly quiet. 17 years of identity had evaporated in a week. I wasn't the CIO, I wasn't the strategist, I wasn't even the problem solver. I was unemployed, replaceable. Michael came home early and found me there, knees pulled to my chest, staring out the window. He sat beside me without a word. What if he wins? I asked quietly. What if he drags this out long enough that no one wants to touch me? Michael took my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. Daniela, he said, voice steady, you didn't lose because you were weak. You lost because you were honest in a dishonest system. Tears burned my eyes, not loud, dramatic tears, but the kind that leak out when strength finally runs out of places to hide. For the first time, I let myself feel it. The betrayal, the exhaustion, the grief of realizing loyalty had been a one-way street. That night, I lay awake listening to the city breathe, wondering who I was without the work that had defined me. This hollow, uncertain space was the lowest point. The moment where bitterness could have hardened into something permanent. The moment where I could have decided Richard deserved to be crushed. Instead, something else began to form. Not revenge. Resolve. Because if I had learned anything from watching Sterling Investments collapse, it was this. Power built on fear always rots from the inside. And I was done carrying someone else's rot. The call came on a Wednesday morning. I almost didn't answer. Unknown number. No caller ID. The kind of interruption you ignore when your life already feels precariously balanced. But something, instinct maybe, made me pick up. Daniela Torres, I said. Ms. Torres, this is Sandra Chen from the Securities and Exchange Commission. My spine straightened instantly. SE calls don't come with good news, or so I'd always believed. Yes, I said carefully. How can I help you? We've concluded our review of Mr. Sterling's complaint, she said, her tone professional, neutral. There is no evidence of wrongdoing on your part. His claim is dismissed with prejudice. I closed my eyes. Dismissed with prejudice meant final, no appeal, no shadow hanging over me. Thank you, I said, the word coming out on a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. There's more, she continued. I sat down slowly. Several former clients of Sterling Investments contacted us directly. They asked for your information. My pulse quickened. We can't make referrals, she added, but there is no restriction on you starting or joining a new fund. When the call ended, the apartment felt suddenly too small for the idea forming in my chest. I wasn't radioactive. I was validated. Richard hadn't buried me. He'd exposed himself. 3 days later, I sat in a conference room overlooking Central Park. Glass walls, quiet confidence, no marble theatrics. Douglas Pritchard, a senior securities attorney with silver hair and a shark's smile, slid a folder toward me. "Richard Sterling will sue you," he said calmly. "Not because he'll win, because he needs someone else to blame." I nodded. I expected that. Pritchard smiled. "Good, because you're not alone." The door opened. Robert Martinez, Greenfield Pension Fund, walked in without waiting for an invitation. "Daniela," he said, sitting down, "I'm here to save us both some time." He didn't waste words. $400 million left Sterling because Tyler Sterling couldn't answer basic questions, he said. "That money still needs management. My board wants you." I stared at him. "Consulting partner," he continued. $5 million base, 20% of returns over benchmark, full control of strategy. $5 million. I felt Michael's words echo in my mind. "You didn't lose because you were weak." Pritchard slid another document across the table. 7 clients, he said. Greenfield, Colombia, Norway, 3 family offices, 2 PE groups, about $1.5 billion in potential assets. The room went quiet. For the first time since Richard fired me, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I looked at Robert. No politics. He nodded. "Only results." I signed. Not in anger. In clarity. That night, Michael opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for someday. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Yes," I said honestly, "but I'm not small anymore." I wasn't stepping back into someone else's shadow. I was building something that didn't need a legacy name to stand. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment. And once I stopped fighting to be recognized, everything moved faster than I ever imagined. Success doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, through numbers that hold, calls that come back, trust that rebuilds itself faster than you expect when it was never truly broken to begin with. 6 months after I signed that first agreement, Torres Capital Management was real. Not aspirational, not theoretical. Real. We started lean, no marble lobbies, no ego-driven titles, just competence, discipline, and a culture built around one rule: never confuse confidence with ability. Clients followed. Not because I chased them, because they chased stability. Greenfield expanded their allocation. Colombia came back with conditions I met without theatrics. Norway's sovereign fund returned after one call that lasted 12 minutes and ended with, "We're comfortable again." By the time the press caught on, we were managing over $3 billion. Headlines shifted tone. From Sterling collapse to Torres. Serge, former CIO, builds new powerhouse clients bet on competence over legacy. Richard watched it all unfold from the wrong side of the glass. Sterling Investments hemorrhaged what remained of its credibility. Without client money, the illusion collapsed fast. The board turned on him. Advisors resigned. Vendors stopped returning calls. And Tyler? Tyler quit. No dramatic exit, no public meltdown. One morning, he simply didn't show up. Weeks later, Michael told me Tyler had taken a teaching job, high school math, coaching basketball after hours. "He sounds relieved," Michael said carefully. I felt something unexpected then. Not triumph, relief. Because Tyler was never the villain. He was collateral damage in a war he never understood, raised to believe inheritance could substitute preparation. Richard, however, had no such excuse. He tried to fight. He sued, he lost, he appealed, he lost again. The legal fees drained what little remained. Pride kept him from pulling his own money early. By the time he tried, it was too late. Sterling Investments filed for bankruptcy. 3 weeks later, I sat in a courtroom watching the judge review the assets. The name, the infrastructure, the brand. I bought it all for $12 million. Not because I wanted it, but because I didn't want anyone else wearing it like stolen valor. Richard sat 2 rows ahead of me. He looked smaller than I remembered. Shoulders slumped, hair gone gray in months instead of years. When he signed the final papers, his hand shook. He didn't look back. I didn't smile. Some victories don't need witnesses. The fallout didn't end there. Richard's social circle evaporated. Invitations stopped. The Hamptons house sold at a loss. Manhattan friends remembered urgent conflicts whenever his name came up. Power, it turned out, was conditional. Meanwhile, my life grew quieter. Michael and I moved into a home that felt like ours. Not curated, not performative. And when I told him I was pregnant, his joy was unfiltered, uncalculated, the kind of happiness that doesn't care about optics. 8 months later, Richard's doctor called. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Michael asked me to go with him to see his father. Not for him, he said. For us. For our daughter. So I went. Richard lived in a cramped studio in Queens by then. No staff, no art, no mirrors. When he saw me, he cried. I was jealous, he admitted, for 17 years. You made it look easy. I couldn't stand being second to my son-in-law. I listened. Not as his victim. As someone who had already moved on. I forgive you, I said, not to absolve him, but to release myself. 4 months later, he died. He held his granddaughter once. At the funeral, Tyler spoke about failure and humility. He looked lighter than he ever had in a tailored suit. As I stood there with Michael, our daughter sleeping against my chest, I understood something fully for the first time. The fallout didn't destroy me. It clarified me. My daughter, Isabella, is almost 1 now. She has my husband's calm eyes and my curiosity, fingers always reaching, mind always working. When she laughs, the room softens. When she cries, everything else stops mattering. Torres Capital manages just under $5 billion. But that's not the number I measure my life by anymore. Every morning, I still wake up early. Old habits die hard. But now, the quiet isn't filled with dread or obligation. It's filled with intention. I make coffee that actually tastes good. I read reports because I want to, not because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't. Sometimes Isabella crawls into my office, slaps her hand against my desk, and babbles like she's negotiating a hostile takeover. I let her. Because leadership doesn't start with dominance. It starts with presence. Last week, she pointed at a framed photo on my shelf. Richard Sterling, younger, smiling, full of certainty. Who's that? Michael asked her gently. She blinked, unimpressed. That, I said, lifting her into my arms, is someone who made big mistakes and loved his family anyway. Michael watched me, searching my face. Do you ever regret not crushing him when you had the chance? I thought about it. About the power I could have wielded, the humiliation I could have inflicted. And then I looked at Isabella, chewing thoughtfully on my sleeve. No, I said, because real victory isn't destruction, it's freedom. Richard taught me something he never intended to. Success without humility is just expensive loneliness. Loyalty without discernment is self-erasure. And forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about refusing to carry anger into the life you're building. On Tuesdays, Isabella and I get ice cream. Not because it's a tradition. Because one Tuesday, everything I thought defined me fell apart. And I learned what actually mattered. Numbers fluctuate, empires rise and fall, titles fade. But being present, being kind without being small, building something rooted in truth, that lasts. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never confuse who needs you with who values you. And never stay loyal to a system that only respects you when you're silent.